speaker who is actively speaking during the webinar. We can get quite a distracting echo sometimes on Microsoft Teams, so please make sure that your microphones are muted. I have my colleague Sophie, who's behind the scenes, making sure this all works properly, who may mute you if it's causing problems with the sound. So first of all, I'll be inviting our 5 speakers to answer some specific questions about COVID-19 and inequality, and then following the speakers' interventions, we'll open up for questions from the audience. If you think of a question while our speakers are speaking this morning, my colleague Sophie will share a link in the webinar chat to an online form where you can post or write your questions, and we will look at that form just before we post the questions at the end of the presentations. Please don't use the webinar chat to post questions, but rather use the link, and which is a link to a form to post your questions. Of course, we won't necessarily be able to answer all of those questions, but we'll take a good representative example if we can. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll be sharing a list of links to useful resources from the different speakers today. So let's start. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed inequality, it's exacerbated existing inequalities, but it's also given rise to new forms of inequality all over the world. There are, as the UN Secretary General has highlighted, underlying structural inequalities and pervasive discrimination that need to be addressed in the response and aftermath of this crisis. And this is a crisis whose impacts are clearly felt more harshly among those who suffer the consequences of discriminatory laws and practices. Now, these patterns of inequality don't only reflect gaps in the fulfillment of existing human rights obligations, but they are also significant challenges to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are the sorts of barriers to human dignity and development that human rights, and by extension the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, seek to address. So it stands to reason that putting human rights obligations and the SDGs at the core of responses to the pandemic and of long-term recovery strategies really needs human rights law and the SDGs to systematically assess and address the disproportionate impacts of response measures on groups facing discrimination. The vision of sustainable recovery is emphasised in a landmark report by the UN Secretary General on human rights and COVID-19. And this report highlights that the 2030 Agenda, which is underpinned by human rights, provides a comprehensive blueprint for sustainable recovery from the pandemic. Today, we're very lucky to have gathered a panel of 5 experts in their field to explore the potential of using human rights principles, standards, methodologies and tools to ensure that COVID-19 recovery and rebuilding efforts can address the inequality and discrimination that the pandemic has clearly highlighted and exacerbated. Through the presentations that you are about to hear, we hope to highlight how the mutually reinforcing human rights and sustainable development frameworks can be used to enable and accelerate progress and build back more equal societies. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Mehrdad Payande is Professor of International Law, European Law and Public Law at Bucharest Law School in Hamburg. His research is focused on international law, in particular international human rights law, anti-discrimination law, as well as constitutional theory and law. Since 2020, he is a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So welcome to you. And our first question for you would be, what do you see as the key emerging, anticipated or potential discriminatory impacts of state responses to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you very much, Francesca, and I hope you can hear me and see me. Thank you for the invitation. And let me just point out very quickly that I'm a member of CERT, but I'm of course not here representing the official position of CERT, but rather in an individual capacity. I will, however, build upon a statement issued by the committee in August 2020 on the pandemic and its implications under the ICERT. And as Francesca has pointed out, the link will be shared. With regard to the first question on the discriminatory impact of state responses, I would like to make 3 quick points. First, I think it might be useful to emphasize that there are 2 dimensions to the relationship between the pandemic and the question of equality, 2 dimensions of the discriminatory impact of the pandemic. And I think the first dimension we should pay attention to before coming to specific state responses is that the pandemic has highlighted and is continuing to highlight already existing structures of inequality and discrimination, as Francesca has already pointed out, and it does so in a rather brutal manner. For example, to point out just one example, early on in the pandemic, we've seen in the United States that people of color were disproportionately affected by the virus, which of course has nothing to do with any discriminatory nature or impact of the virus itself, but rather with already existing inequalities with regard to anything from working conditions, housing situation, access to health services, and so on. And this leads me to my second point, the question of who is actually affected by the virus in a discriminatory manner. From the perspective of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the focus is, of course, on groups that are subjected to or vulnerable to racial discrimination, and which we can see are particularly affected by the virus. And just pointing out one dimension, indigenous peoples, for example, are oftentimes living in remote and isolated areas with, for example, only limited access to safety measures and healthcare services. But we, of course, not only see the discriminatory impact based on criteria such as race and ethnicity, but also members of other groups particularly affected. For example, when we come to gender, we see that women are usually at the forefront of both the healthcare working force as well as the service industry in general, leading them to be being particularly exposed to the danger of infection. We see women disproportionately affected in terms of the economic impact. And we see, of course, also the higher risk and rise in domestic violence in connection with the pandemic. At the end, I think the pandemic quite clearly shows that discrimination does not work among or along neatly separated lines or categories, as for example, race or gender, but that it usually transgresses these lines and has an intersectional dimension, for example, affecting women of color in a specific manner. And in the pandemic, we see that there is oftentimes a strong correlation between the economic status, the economic situation of a person, and his or her belonging to a particular group that is vulnerable to discrimination based on race or gender, for example. My third point, coming to the discriminatory impact of specific state responses, I would like to point out rather selectively a few aspects that seem to be of particular importance. In the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen a focus on the discriminatory nature and impact of measures addressing directly the pandemic, such as lockdowns, quarantine orders, and so forth. We've seen a rise of the use of racist stereotypes and of hate speech in public discourse, both by state representatives as well as in society at large, which of course raises human rights questions and triggers in particular obligations under the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we've seen the potentially discriminatory nature of state responses with regard to the impact of the pandemic in economic and social terms, with regard to measures that are aimed at mitigating the impact of the pandemic on, for example, access to healthcare services, both with regard to the virus and healthcare in general, with regard to housing, employment, education, and so forth. Last, and at the moment, probably most importantly, the most important aspect is, of course, the unequal distribution of vaccines for COVID-19, both with regard to the question of how the vaccine is distributed within a state and which criteria guide the decision of how this distribution has to take place, and with regard to the question of how it is shared and distributed globally. And here I think it is very hard to be optimistic, notwithstanding promising initiatives aimed at facilitating global access, such as COVAX. because we see a strong focus of states as well as of public discourse on providing the vaccine first and foremost among their populations, and not too many signs of global solidarity in this regard. And I think I'll leave it at this with regard to the first question.
Thank you for that response. So in follow-up to what you've just mentioned, it would be great if you could highlight what states' key obligations are relating to equality and non-discrimination, in particular in relation to their COVID-19 responses, and also how you think international human rights monitoring should inform states' responses to the pandemic and related efforts to get the SDGs back on track. And this is, of course, bearing in mind that the third committee has a mandate to review states' compliance with their existing human rights obligations under that convention. Thank you.
Okay. With regard to key human rights obligations, I think it is useful to refer to the classical human rights framework of the obligation to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights. With regard to the obligation to respect, we can highlight the duty of states to refrain from enacting and executing measures and policies that have a discriminatory impact. With regard to the obligation to protect, we can highlight that states must protect all members of their respective communities from discriminatory There seemed to be a problem with the sound.
We can hear you now.
Okay.
Yes, you muted momentarily.
Okay, then I'll just continue. I think I tried to highlight the obligation to protect, the duty of states to protect all members and of their communities from discriminatory actions related to the pandemic, such as hate speech, racially motivated violence, and so on. And we can look at the obligation to fulfill, which most directly touches upon economic, social, and cultural rights, and thereby also the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. And here I think there's a lot of potential for highlighting the way in which human rights obligations frame the response of states to the pandemic and have to be respected by states. For example, with regard I seem to keep getting muted. Okay, I just unmuted myself and try to continue. With regard to the obligation to fulfill, I think we can also highlight with regard to measures aimed at providing relief in terms of the economic impact of the pandemic, the obligation to do so in a non-discriminatory manner, but of course also with regard to the distribution of the vaccine, which may not be guided by discriminatory criteria. Apart from this general human rights framework, I would like to point out two further specific implications of a human rights perspective on state responses to the pandemic, which also highlight the interconnectedness of human rights on the one hand and the Sustainable Development Goals on the other hand. First, I think there is the need for more and more specific information. We need data on the disparate impact of the pandemic, of the way in which the pandemic and state responses to the pandemic affect specific groups that are already struggling with inequality and which are vulnerable to discrimination. And secondly, I think it's useful to highlight that measures aimed at addressing the pandemic and its impact cannot be decided in a purely top-down manner, but must rather be developed in a participatory process, taking into account the position of all groups specifically affected. You highlighted also the question of what role human rights monitoring can play. Well, we've seen a huge number of statements of UN treaty bodies, but also UN special procedures and mandate holders highlighting the human rights dimension of the pandemic and of state responses. And I think that is important, and I think that is our job, because otherwise human rights do not seem to play such a pivotal role in the debates surrounding the pandemic. With regard to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I would just like to point out that in the statement of August 2020, which I've already mentioned, the committee has highlighted that it will closely monitor the impact of the pandemic on the prohibition of discrimination. And there, apart from the so-called early warning and urgent action procedure, in which the committee can be called upon in cases of alleged violations of the prohibition of racial discrimination, the focus will be on state responses to the pandemic in the context of the so-called state reporting procedure. As most of you will be aware, states have the obligation to regularly report to the committee and to other committees about the way they comply with their obligations under the convention. And in this process, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has started to request information from states as to the potential disparate impact of the virus within their societies, as well as with regard to the measures taken by states to address these impacts, and thereby highlighting as specific as possible the human rights obligations of states in the context of the pandemic and of its impacts. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that very informative initial presentation. I think you raised some very interesting points about the multidimensional, complex nature of discrimination and inequality, and so it's not necessarily a straightforward thing to address. You also highlighted that we really need data on the impacts on different groups, which I think is something that we might be hearing about later from one of our other speakers. And also, I think good to hear that you know that there will be an ongoing monitoring of states' obligations in relation to inequality and equality and non-discrimination in relation to the pandemic. Now we will move on to our second speaker. Commissioner Jonas Ben Sibanjoni is a part-time commissioner at the South African Human Rights Commission, primarily in charge of three focal areas: land, the right to food, and environment. He's also a practicing attorney and a commissioner of the Small Claims Court. Before joining the South African Human Rights Commission, he held positions as a member of the Amnesty Committee, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and at the South African Parliament. He was also a commissioner of the Judicial Services Commission and a whip of the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Constitutional Development, among other things. So welcome to Commissioner Sibanjoni. First question for you is about the role of national human rights institutions. As independent state institutions, how are national human rights institutions and equality bodies using their mandates to ensure that the fundamental principles of non-discrimination and equality are actually guiding states' COVID-19 responses and recovery efforts? Commissioner, your microphone is muted.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us at the South African Human Rights Commission, and then good day to everybody. And to answer your first question, I would like to say that as the South African Human Rights Commission, we are empowered in terms of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa Act number 108 of 1996. That is the first empowering legislation. And secondly, we've got an enabling legislation, the South African Human Rights Commission Act number 40 of 2013, and as well as the legislation that enables us to attend to any discriminations, that is the Promotion of Equality and Prohibition of Unfair Discrimination Act. The acronym thereof is PEPUDA. And since the advent of the coronavirus And since the president of the country announced on the 23rd of March 2020 or 2020, the South African Human Rights Commission took it upon itself to ensure that the rights that are guaranteed in terms of Section Chapter 2 of the Constitution are not violated. And as the Human Rights Commission, we formed what was called a war room, in terms of which we were monitoring through the length and breadth of our country as to what effect the state of disaster that was announced was having on the people of South Africa. And through each and every province, we've got provincial offices that are on the ground, and wherever they are picking up any violations, they escalate those violations to the national office, and then weekly we had a meeting of the war room in terms of which we would analyze and see what steps needed to be taken. And insofar as using the mandate of the South African Human Rights Commission, I would like to point out that the Commission has accordingly engaged with government to help ensure that the regulations are human rights compliant. Several meetings were held with the lawmakers where the concerns and challenges facing vulnerable groups were presented by the Commission. And the Commission has also provided recommendations and input on draft regulations, such as those pertaining to basic education and that relates to schools. On one occasion, the South African Human Rights Commission made a request to attend the meetings of the NCC. The NCC is the National Coronavirus Command Council, but unfortunately, it was explained that that council was an intergovernmental structure, and that us as the South African Human Rights Commission, being an independent institution, we were not able to be part and parcel of that NCC, the National Coronavirus Command Council. But we didn't end there. We had an opportunity to engage the minister who is responsible for implementing the legislation, the Disaster Management Act. And that minister is called the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. And we made some submissions, and I must say that some of our submissions were taken into account. And also, as I've mentioned, the question of schools. We had a meeting with the Minister of Basic Education, and our submissions and recommendations were also taken into account. Now, I want to further state that the Commission has established several participatory platforms at national level to monitor housing, water, or sanitation and education in terms of the pandemic. And further, the Commission plans to host several webinars with lawmakers and affected groups in order to promote the rights of vulnerable groups. The Commission has a mandate to monitor vaccine rollout to ensure equitable distribution, more especially this second wave of the coronavirus. And it has been said that in South Africa, the vaccine will be prioritized for the front line health workers. And then there has been some concerns through the length and breadth of the country to say, how are the other people cared for? The increased economic pressure in an already unequal society in South Africa has led to increased xenophobia over social media and on-ground truck driver violence. The Commission is thus pursuing the social media chapter, the social media charter project, in addition to serving on relevant working groups regarding non-nationals. Just before lockdown, the Commission convened an inquiry into violence directed at non-nationals truck drivers. The violence has again erupted recently, and the Commission is working towards releasing its report as soon as possible, because after holding that inquiry, the Commission made certain findings as well as recommendations. And then very soon the Commission will release for the public the report that it has established. And then I must also say that the situation in South Africa is a very unequal society. And then the coronavirus has also added to it, because we find that the rich are getting more richer, and the poorer are getting more poorer. And then further than that, we also had some challenges when the government came with some relief strategies, and that those relief strategies, some of them did not reach the beneficiaries. And then also, as the Human Rights Commission, we had to ensure that the provisions of the Constitution are implemented, because Section 27 of the Constitution talks about the right to food and water. There are certain areas in our country where there is no water, and then there are also certain communities that did not receive the food relief schemes and the like. And as the watchdog on human rights, as the Human Rights Commission, I will say that we are throughout the length and breadth of our country to ensure that there is no discrimination, and then that we maintain equality as enshrined in section number 9 of our Constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that very informative response about how the South African Human Rights Commission has monitored the situation related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I have a second question for you, bearing in mind the close linkages between human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. So in particular, what role do you see for national human rights institutions in contributing to an improved monitoring of Sustainable Development Goals and targets related to equality and non-discrimination?
Right, as regards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, one has to ensure that South Africa meets its international treaty obligations, where a treaty is ratified and domesticated in line with the requirements of the constitutional prescripts. And in the same vein, a strategic collaboration with civil society is essential to monitor compliance with treaty obligations, as the resource base of the Chapter 9 is a small, but joining hands with outreach is greater, and hence the impact will be stronger to ensure equality and non-discrimination in delivery of basic goods and services to the poor and vulnerable communities. Because the NHRIs have constitutional powers to leverage the corridors of power, they are best placed to ensure access to remedies by creating an enabling environment to access justice for the poor and the vulnerable. The situation in South Africa is that we have the National Development Plan, and it was adopted by all parties in Parliament. And then I must also mention that as the South African Human Rights Commission, we have an A accreditation status. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic, the strategies and the plans have been sort of delayed. And then the Commission has provided a submission to the South Africa's Voluntary National Review before the high-level political forum. And the Commission has administrative data to help measure the incidence of discrimination in South Africa. The Commission will continue to incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals monitoring into its comprehensive constitutional mandate to monitor and assess the observance of all human rights in South Africa. And then the Commission has experienced challenges in ensuring that it is included in any participatory fora established by government in respect of the Sustainable Development Goals. We believe that the solution will be to join hands with other stakeholders, and also that in order to achieve, we have to not work in a solitary situation, but to see other people and other stakeholders that have got also the same mandate like the other human rights bodies in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Sibanyoni, for that very interesting intervention. I think it's worth highlighting that you mentioned that national human rights institutions do have already quite a lot of data on discrimination, on inequality that can be used, given that our first speaker mentioned that there really is a lack of data on inequality. Without further ado, I think we'll move on to the next speaker. Ariane Adam leads the Equal Rights Trust's legal research work on the rights to equality and non-discrimination and their role in the realisation of other human rights and development, as well as the Equal Rights Trust programme of support to lawyers providing legal services and the implementation of the organisation's body of strategic litigation. She's an experienced legal practitioner with a specialisation in discrimination and human rights claims. So welcome, Ariane, to this webinar. So the first question for you is about equality impact assessments. I think it would be very helpful if you could explain to us a little bit more about what equality impact assessments are and what role they play in ensuring a solid foundation upon which to build back better and to reduce inequality and support the SDG's intention to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to be part of this panel. We had a very helpful summary from Professor Payande as our first speaker on the obligation to respect, protect and fulfill the right to non-discrimination under international human rights law. And before delving into answering the question and talking about equality impact assessment, I just wanted to add to the summary of that obligation, particularly for those joining us that may have less of a background in international human rights law, that discrimination can be direct and indirect. So all the key human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, highlight the obligation to protect, fulfill, to respect, protect, and fulfill both direct and indirect discrimination. Direct discrimination is where, for example, a policy, a state policy, would treat a person with a protected characteristic less favorably than another group has been or would be in a comparable situation. While indirect discrimination occurs where a state applies a provision, criterion, or practice which puts persons having protected status at a particular disadvantage compared with other persons, unless the state can objectively justify that policy. And by that we mean the state can show that the policy meets a legitimate aim and the means of achieving that legitimate aim are appropriate and necessary. So equality impact assessment is an essential tool to meet these obligations, and it's equally necessary in the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals and their central commitment to leave no one behind, as well as the specific target in Goal 10 to reduce inequality within and among countries, and target 10.3 in particular to ensure equal opportunity and reduce inequality of outcome. Equality impact assessment is really what it says on the tin. It's to assess the equality impacts of policy responses. And through assessing such impacts, states and development actors should be in a position to anticipate and eliminate any discriminatory impacts the implementation of a policy can have, including those impacts which are unintended or unforeseen, which is often the case with indirect discrimination in particular. So what is actually an equality impact assessment? A key element of assessing equality impacts is to collect and consider data and research on the experiences and outcomes of groups exposed to discrimination. And equally important, it is to consult all groups that may be disproportionately affected by a policy. And I would say that consultation is key and can be more valuable and more important, particularly in assessing impacts before a policy is implemented. So thinking, for example, taking the rollout of the vaccine, many states, to take an example from the UK, where I am based, we are seeing that in deciding the categories of persons that will be given priority for the vaccine, the state hasn't fully considered the disproportionate impact that the virus has had on Black and other minority ethnic communities in the UK. So there have been many calls to reconsider who should be prioritized by looking at that experience more carefully and looking at the data that Public Health England, for example, has recovered on these disproportionate impacts on these communities, which, as Professor Payande highlighted at the beginning, have more to do with pre-existing social and economic inequalities and how those pre-existing inequalities have been exacerbated. So the first element of equality impact assessment is the collection of data, both quantitative and qualitative. Then it is important to use that information to decide whether there is or there is likely to be a differential impact, whether a direct differential impact or an indirect one on a group with a protected characteristic. And just to highlight here that under international human rights law, there are a wide range of people protected. The characteristics include race, gender, disability, health status, sexual orientation and gender identity, and they also include other status. So all of the treaty bodies have been very clear that it is an open list, and you really need to look at disparate and differential impacts. So if there is likely to be such an impact on a group, it is important to consider as part of the equality impact assessment whether the policy is nonetheless justified. So does the policy meet a legitimate aim? And is that legitimate aim, is meeting that legitimate aim necessary? And if so, is it proportionate to pursue it, bearing in mind the discriminatory impacts or the potential discriminatory impacts that your assessment has identified? And then even if the policy can be justified in undertaking equality impact assessments, states should also consider and implement any measures which might mitigate the impact. So really, equality impact assessment at its core must be aimed at identifying and eliminating the actual or potential direct or indirect discriminatory effects of policies. And in implementing them substantially and meaningfully, states and development actors can ensure that their policies and programs respond and accommodate the different needs of diverse groups with due consideration to intersectionality, and they do not create or exacerbate inequality. The Equal Rights Trust has published a training manual on no COVID discrimination, which will be shared, I understand, from our partners at the Danish Institute. I think I'll leave my first question at that.
Okay, thank you very much for that very informative description of some of the concepts and the related to equality and the basic idea of an equality impact assessment. Very concretely, what are the steps or the key steps that states and development actors need to take to ensure that COVID-19 recovery serves to reduce inequalities as opposed to exacerbating those inequalities?
Yes, we had very helpful summaries from both our first two speakers on the discriminatory impacts that we have seen on human rights and development since the beginning of 2020. To avoid inequalities becoming even more pronounced in the long term, states and development actors should place human rights obligations and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of their response measures and recovery strategies. What we want to see ideally is a human rights and sustainable development approach by design to recovery and response measures going forward. In May 2020, the Equal Rights Trust brought together a coalition of global equality organizations in a call to action, which will also be shared, to call on all states to take immediate action by incorporating in particular equality impact assessments as an integral element of their ongoing public health, economic and social policy responses to the crisis. And in thinking about undertaking equality impact assessment in responding and recovering from COVID-19, consultation is key. Many of us cannot anticipate, no matter what our experience or our knowledge or our good intentions, it is very, very hard to anticipate the impacts that policies will have. And it is impossible to do so, I would argue, without consulting and bringing to the table different groups that may be affected. So in thinking about responding and recovering from the pandemic, we really must put a focus on the collection and consideration of qualitative data, as well as put measures in place and enable the collection of quantitative data as well once a policy has been implemented. Because one thing I want to highlight is that equality impact assessment should be done at the beginning before a policy is implemented, but it should also be integrated in the monitoring of the policy as well. So you may have a policy that you have done an equality impact assessment and haven't identified any discriminatory impacts, or there hasn't been time to do a full consultation before implementing the policy because it's an emergency response. But in monitoring what effect your policy is having, equality impact assessment must be integrated at the monitoring stage as well, and the policy should be removed or amended if states and development actors identify that it is having discriminatory impacts. So the key steps are, firstly, the consultation and collection of qualitative data, but also adopting and implementing more systems for the collection of quantitative data, and very importantly, disaggregated quantitative data. And this is particularly key in measuring the progress on meeting sustainable development goals and leaving no one behind. Because if we only look at the experience of certain groups and exclude others, and in particular exclude marginalized communities, it is impossible, I would say, to assess whether the sustainable development goals are truly leaving no one behind.
Thank you, Ariane, for that very informative presentation. It contained very useful concrete guidance, I think, for people who are listening into this webinar. And as Ariane mentioned, we'll be sharing a list of resources from each of the speakers at the webinar towards the end. You mentioned in particular the importance of consultation with rights holders and disaggregated data, which are two of the issues that our next speakers will address. Thank you very much for that. Before we move on to our next speaker, I just want to remind the audience that they can post questions for the speakers through the link that my colleague Sophie has posted in the webinar chat. So please, if you have any questions, we'll be asking them after our next two presentations. Our next speaker, Sarkis Balkan, is a human rights activist focusing on the Middle East and the South Caucasus regions. He's the executive director of Aleppo Ngo, an Armenia-based group supporting refugees from Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, and Nagorno-Karabakh. He has previously worked at Human Rights Watch and USA for UNHCR in Washington, and holds BA in Political Science and Genocide Studies, and an MA in Diplomacy and International Relations from Yerevan State University. Welcome to the webinar, Sarkis. My first question for you is what the impact of COVID-19 has been, or COVID-19 response measures has been, in particular on the groups that you work with?
Could you hear me? First of all, thank you, Francesca, and thank you to the Danish Institute for Human Rights for the invitation to attend and participate in this webinar. I must start off, I just want to add one additional category of target groups that we work with, which are the Syrian refugees in the Republic of Armenia. So a bit of background about Aleppo Ngo. It was created in 2013 by a group of Syrian refugee women who had ended up in the Republic of Armenia to provide various forms of humanitarian relief assistance to the refugees that were arriving or escaping the Syrian conflict and arriving to the Republic of Armenia. And I would say that 95% of the founding members of our organization were females. That's probably because men tend to create the world's problems and women try hard to solve them. But in terms of what we have witnessed over the course of the past 9-10 months already, since the pandemic reached Armenia at the beginning of March 2020, is that the COVID-19 pandemic has not only created additional levels of discrimination against vulnerable populations, but have exposed the levels of discrimination that have inherently existed within society in Armenia, but all around the world, as as we listen to all the speakers, we understand that the pandemic has simply further exposed the inherent levels of discrimination that exist in any society across the world. The one thing that I must say is, if this webinar was taking place on September 26th, I think my presentation may have been slightly different in explaining the context in which we have been working, because as many of you may have heard, between September 27th and November 10th, there was the ongoing conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which further complicated the challenges that have risen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in Armenia. So from the very beginning of the pandemic, the first case that was ever registered in Armenia was on February 29th, if I'm not mistaken, and it was registered on March 1st. Armenia has consistently been in the top 25 countries in terms of cases per 1 million population, as well as deaths per 1 million population. But our focus as an organization, because we work primarily with initially, we started off with Syrian refugees, and unfortunately, with new conflicts arising around the world, as well as natural disasters such as the Beirut explosion in August 2020, as well as the most recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh region, Aleppo Ngo has had to react and in essence, complement the government's response to the humanitarian crisis that has risen as a result of conflicts and natural disasters. But in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and its disproportionate impact on refugees, so in the case of Syrian refugees specifically, which has been the focus of our research on labor rights issues over the past couple of years, as well as the focus of our advocacy efforts in terms of lobbying the Armenian government to make legislative as well as administrative changes to adjust their response to widespread labor rights violations against Syrian refugees. It's important to understand the context in which these refugees exist, because not all refugees are in the same situation as others. So the particularity of the context in which they exist and they operate in the societies and the economies that they exist in is paramount in our understanding of the types of challenges that refugees face. Armenia, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, underwent one of the most rigorous levels of privatization of properties. And as we know, in the case of any refugee population around the world, but more specifically in the case of Syrian refugees and other refugees and displaced populations in Armenia, housing has been the #1 challenge that they have faced since 2012. Because the state government or the government agencies have been unable to provide state provided housing to refugees and displaced populations. They were unable to do so in the case of the Syrian refugees. They were unable to do so in the case of Lebanese displaced individuals who escaped the Beirut explosion and arrived to Armenia. And at the moment, we see that with more than 70,000 refugees that escaped the Nagorno-Karabakh region and arrived to Armenia, the vast majority of them do not have free housing provided by the Armenian government. So the #1 challenge that they face is housing, and it is directly interrelated with the labor rights violations and the consequences of labor rights violations that are prevalent across the country of Armenia, but it impacts refugee and displaced populations in a far more disproportionate way, in a far more negative way than the local population. As I mentioned, with the privatization of properties, more than 90% of the local population in Armenia have homes, which provides a level of economic security to them. Whereas in the case of, for example, the Syrian refugees, 90% are obligated to rent homes. And even if we take into account the assumption that the Syrian refugees have completely integrated within Armenia's society over the last 7 or 8 years, if a Syrian refugee is making, let's say, $500 a month in comparison to the same salary that a local population or a local person is making in Armenia's difficult economic climate, then 30 to 40% of the income that a Syrian refugee is going to, that a Syrian refugee is generating through employment, is directed towards housing rental fees, as opposed to the local population, which, as I mentioned, have private properties that they inherited following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in terms of the discrimination that we have been focusing on over the last couple of years is the labor rights abuses against Syrian refugees, which according to our research shows that if we only take into account certain types of labor rights violations, such as exceeding the weekly limit of hours worked for refugees, undocumented employment, as well as underregistered employment, almost 87% of Syrian refugees fall victim to labor rights abuses in the country. And as a consequence of the two primary levels of, or two primary types of labor rights violations that occur in Armenia, which are the undocumented as well as underregistered employment, when the Armenian government introduced 23 intervention measures to support those who were losing their jobs as a result of the pandemic through the provision of unemployment assistance, the vast majority of Syrian refugees, not because the state had discriminated against them, but because of the indirect and disproportionate discrimination that was prevalent within the legislation that was introduced by the Armenian government, Syrian refugees who were already undocumented employees in Armenia, or underregistered employees, meaning if their actual salary was, let's say, $500, their employers would register them as minimum wage employees in order to evade taxation. Then the vast majority of Syrian refugees were not able to receive the assistance that the Armenian government was providing to those who were losing their employment as a result of the pandemic. And I mean, I can stop there. I think I've spoken long enough, and we can move on to the next question, and I'll try to add more information there.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I think as a follow-up question, because we have another speaker and some questions to take, we should move on to the next question. And this again is about data, which several of the speakers have mentioned already, the importance of data. How do you think policy and lawmakers can ensure better collection of disaggregated data on the impacts of COVID-19 response and recovery measures, given that data is such a crucial way of understanding and addressing the impacts?
As a human rights defender, I just want to also remind that during the process of data collection, and here's an example from the Armenian experience over the last 8-9 months. So the Armenian legislature, or the parliament, on March 31 passed an amendment giving the authorities very broad surveillance powers using cell phone data to track coronavirus cases. And in essence, telecommunication companies were obligated to provide the authorities with phone records of all their customers, including phone numbers, location, time, date of their calls or text messages, in order to identify whether a COVID-19 patient had interacted with other individuals and may have transferred the virus to them as well. So when we're talking about data collection on the part of governments, we need to also keep in mind the right of privacy of citizens. I understand that human rights have been, to a certain extent, undermined as a result of the pandemic because of the government's need to respond for the pandemic and solving the healthcare issues that have been prevalent. But that's one issue to keep in mind when it comes to data collection. But in terms of how lawmakers and policymakers can use data to formulate their policies and create collaborations with different international as well as regional partners. The information that is very important in terms of data collection is to have a centralized database that allows you to understand the inherent discriminatory policies that a government is adopting. As I mentioned, when it came to the unemployment benefits that the Armenian government was providing, Syrian refugees, for a large portion of them, were excluded as a result of undocumented or underregistered employment. But in terms of the numbers that we can look at in the case of Armenia, for example, as I mentioned, Armenia was in a conflict with Azerbaijan over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh between September 27 and November 10. So in the first 210 days of the pandemic, the number of deaths per day were 4.5 cases, or 4.5 individuals. This is the average. The cases per day, the average again for 210 days was 235 cases per day. During the 44 days of conflict, the number of deaths rose by almost or tripled to become 15.5 deaths per day, and the cases went up from 235 to 1,389 cases during the 44 days of the conflict. Since the conflict, of course, Armenia has also been embroiled, unfortunately, in domestic political turmoil as a result of its defeat during the conflict, and therefore the number of deaths in terms of COVID-19 deaths has been rising to almost 20 per day. But the cases have slightly gone down since the days of the 44 days of conflict to 781 cases per day. Now, the data that is important for legislators to come up with in terms of healthcare, for example, is to understand the impact of their specific policies and the types of legislations that they need to adopt to complement the healthcare system, which has been extremely strained as a result of the conflict. So Armenia's case, again, as I mentioned, is a very unique one because it's not only dealing with the pandemic, but with the aftermath of the conflict as well, that the 44-day war, where more than 5,000 people were killed, 8,000 people were maimed. Many of them have now been disabled. So the healthcare system in Armenia is, if it's not already collapsing, it's definitely on the brink of collapse. And when legislators or diplomats even are articulating the healthcare problems that the country is facing and are speaking to donor organizations or donor governments, they need to have access to all types of research and information to acquire the type of assistance that small countries such as Armenia need in order to overcome the pandemic, and to vocalize to the international community that in the case of, for example, the acquisition of vaccines, with the economic issues that Armenia is facing, both as a population as well as a state, it is important and paramount that access to vaccines becomes, if not free, then very cheap as we attempt to overcome the challenges of the pandemic.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll move on to the final speaker before we start to answer some questions from the audience. So last but not least, by any means, we have Dumiso Gacha, who is proudly Pan-African and unequivocally non-binary queer feminist, working on eliminating the barriers between grassroots experiences and global policymaking. They are the founder of Success Capital, which is a youth-led, managed and grassroots-serving NGO based in Gaborone, and whose work centres on moving LGBTIQ+ youth from a state of survival to one of success. Welcome, Dumiso, to our webinar. And my first question for you is around the issue of consultation, which has been raised by a couple of our speakers already. How can the rights holders that you work with be more effectively and meaningfully consulted on pandemic recovery efforts?
Thank you so much. I think the first thing is to highlight the fact that there's already a lot of existing multi-stakeholder infrastructure, particularly, noting the fact that Botswana was one of the countries with the highest incidences of HIV. And so when we speak about community health systems, particularly in technical working groups, country coordinating mechanisms that are supported by the Global Fund on HIV, malaria, and TB, I think those are the first point of contact, because you find that key population-led organizations, key populations speaking to LGBT, sex workers, and other vulnerable groups at risk of HIV have been part of these consultative forums in partnership with various ministries. And I think what's critical about this is also acknowledging and recognizing the importance of linking community operational research and data to these policy decision-making and implementing spaces. In instances where that infrastructure might not necessarily be enabling or allowing, especially when we're speaking about disadvantaged groups or more ableist platforms, I think it's critical for us to recognize the important role in which media plays, particularly around the hardest of lockdowns. We had media being one of the essential services and actually flagging issues, maybe where there might be shortcomings in terms of the healthcare value chain, or where service delivery levels were not as should be the normal or up to standard. And so I think it's really critical for civil society to be able to not just be able to rely on media, but also to sort of partner with media in flagging some of the issues that do come up from operational research. And I think maybe one last avenue is the fact that, we live in an era of social media, and Botswana particularly has got a 160% cell phone penetration. Despite the fact that data is quite expensive, at the end of the day, we still have a high level of cell phone penetration and information dissemination, which then obviously allows not just to share critical information that is specific to vulnerable groups, such as trans individuals who might be on hormonal therapy, for instance, or might need critical NHR services, but also to counter disinformation, which was really quite prevalent during the hardest of lockdowns. Botswana is currently under a 1 year, initially it was 6 months, state of emergency, which means there are privacy concerns, there are issues where there's violence, where we had the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence, and more importantly and glaringly, the increased level of care work and burden. And so I think some of these things do come up from that operational or implementation research, which is very critical for feeding into some of that infrastructure. And I think it's quite important to highlight, even with the South African experience, the fact that this HIV response infrastructure doesn't necessarily feed into the national country task team or task force, which then obviously created a bit of mishaps in terms of information and inclusiveness in some of the responses. But I think those are the three key main things, having learned just from our own experiences in Botswana. First, in HIV infrastructure. Secondly, in relying and partnering with media. And thirdly, the social media and the ability to actually use it as an asset.
Thank you very much. There's some very interesting thoughts there about consultation and how it can be more effectively done. I mean, what do you think are the advantages of really implementing a meaningful consultation, and what advantages do you think that brings to the realization, for example, of the SDGs intention to leave no one behind? Why is it important?
I think, the first thing that we've then realized is that, in any cases when we're producing data in terms of either feeding in towards a special procedure or treaty body, you find that maybe there might be only one perspective that is shared, one that is either elitist, ableist, and might be quite linear, because a lot of work or development programming tends to be a tad bit linear because there are certain M&E indicators you have to report on. And so we find that a lot of data usually is quite statistical. And I love, I think it was Adrian who had mentioned the use of qualitative data, because when for us at Success Capital, we value the use of participatory research. And this is what really allows for us to actually provide or feed into national processes. So the Botswana Council of NGOs, as a result of their relationship with the government, actually were allowed to feed into different parliamentary processes, oversight processes that spoke to outcomes of the SDGs and even international obligations in which Botswana is party to. And I think it's very critical in recognizing that the same pool of data, in acknowledging and highlighting and illuminating the shared vulnerabilities, for instance, of sex workers and LGBTI youth, can be the very same outcomes or indicators applied to persons with disabilities. And so I think it's very critical for us to be able to recognize that in having multi-stakeholder partners, or at least processes that allow for feeding into that process, we, one, not only leave anyone behind, but we ensure the indivisibility and the safeguarding of human rights. And I think what's critical about it is that, in many instances, we don't speak about the indivisibility or universality of human rights. And in many instances, we tend to believe that civil society research doesn't deserve to be in the same platform where bureaucrats tend to review data. And I think what we've learned, particularly from the HIV response, and I say this because significant investments and progress have informed a lot of COVID-19 responses in country and in the region. And I think this is very critical because it then allows for us to then evaluate where are we within the context of universal health coverage? Where are we within the context of universal human rights, whether it's the Maputo Protocol or whether it's recognizing some of the important instruments that lie in Africa's Agenda 2063 or Botswana's own Vision 2036. All of these are highly aligned to the SDGs, and I think what's important is in being able to link them together. And how do we link them together? By addressing the issues of the outliers that don't normally meet the normative standards in terms of quantitative data or statistical averages, the outliers that don't actually correlate with mainstream national data outcomes. And these outliers really come to the forefront when we're looking at qualitative data, because they highlight, yes, there's limited access to the internet, but we don't know whether that's because of the infrastructure, the bandwidth, or it's purely because of affordability. And so I think qualitative data obviously then allows for that. And I think that's the value of being able to be quite inclusive. I think one last thing is also, it allows for us to, in having very inclusive consultative processes, it allows for us to imagine feminist futures that are gendered, non-ableist, non-racial, futures that actually look beyond just saying, oh, by 2020, we must have achieved a certain X target. But that, what does that mean in terms of quality of life? What does that mean in terms of the ability for one to pay to actually access a health facility? And then you then realize that we're actually speaking in a more comprehensive, in a more systemic, and in a more, I guess, a humanist perspective or lens.
Thank you very, very much for an extremely rich and useful and very concrete intervention there. I think there are many questions that we all have and that the audience have for our speakers. Well, unfortunately, we're not able to respond to all of them, but I will try and summarize or collate some of the questions that we've received from the audience. Whoops. Okay, so there are some general questions from the audience for anyone in the panel who would wish to respond. So I think perhaps the panelists can use the raise hand function if they wish to respond to some of these general questions. I'm going to try and sort of combine some of the different questions. So there's a question around whether the panelists have seen any positive signs of states changing their course of action to overcome discrimination during the pandemic, and if any best practices can be shared in that regard. There's another question about best practices, requesting that if speakers can highlight a best practice where all stakeholders, including state, civil society, private sector, etc., have joined hands for a successful COVID-19 response to fight inequality. So I will put that out to the panelists as the first question. So please raise your hands if you would like to respond to that, panelists. Do we have anyone with some? Okay, the panelists. This is for the panelists to respond to. Who wants to start?
Hello, my name is Ahmed from Egypt. I have a question regarding.
Hello, can you put your question in the link that my colleague Sophie sent, please? Because we're not able to, unfortunately, answer all the questions. It's in the webinar chat, the link. She has just posted it there. Do any of our panelists from today want to answer that question? Do they have any positive examples of states changing their course of action or any good practices to share? Yes, please do me so. You're on mute if you want to, and followed by Mehrdad.
Thanks, Francesca. I think maybe one example that I can give is, following uproars around regulation changes in response to the COVID pandemic, the government had changed ways in which regulations needed to be implemented. So, for instance, essential service permits were the only ones that were allowed for interzonal travel because we had districts that were demarcated. And, following uproars, especially around local support, where there was a huge drive to support the local economy, particularly in tourism, we had instances where the government had changed some of the modalities around regulations. And so I think that was just a positive example of how social media and different groups can actually be a bit more proactive in terms of maybe more inclusive ways or more accommodative ways of regulations. And more notably, in terms of people with disabilities being included or rather consulted on, for instance, with regulations being issued in Braille, even though that might have, even when it's not necessarily a direct action of government, but more so with government providing the resources for civil societies that advocate for people with disabilities to at least then ensure that they're communicating appropriately and integrate and include their communities within the response. So I think those are just maybe two examples in terms of instances where government has considered others and changed their regulations.
Thank you. And I think Professor Payande had a response as well.
Yes, because if I understood it correctly, one of the questions was also about the international dimension of the reaction. And here I would just want to point out that although the debate about, in particular, the distribution of vaccines is very much focused on specific states and debated within states, there is a big international initiative, the COVAX initiative, including many stakeholders, both from international organizations, states, and the industry, to try to come up with a framework to enable global access to the vaccine. Now, in how far that will be successful, we don't know yet. But I think this is one positive example of how global solidarity and global cooperation in the pandemic can come about.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very helpful response. Do any of our other panelists have any examples of good practice that they'd like to share? I'll take that as a no. Okay, I have another question, which is specifically for Ariane. around education and equality. So it's a very long question, so I'll try to summarize. Because the question sort of summarizes the situation in relation to the equality issues that have been exacerbated, or inequality that has been exacerbated by school and educational institution closure during the crisis. Of course, impacting on the right to education of the most marginalized and vulnerable staff, of course, in the education sector. So in relation to the right to health and the rights to education, are there any best practices or any models of good practices that you are aware of in this regard? And that question was specifically for Ariane from the Equal Rights Trust.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's a really pertinent question because, as correctly identified, there are two elements in play. First of all, school closures affecting the education of children, particularly children that may not have access on remote working or may rely on going to school for free school meals, or may rely to going to school for safeguarding measures. They become a lot more vulnerable if they stay at home. So there is that element, and then there is the element of putting teachers at risk, and that managing the health risks for teachers who are a lot more susceptible to the virus than children. And again, to pick an example from the UK, just where I am based, one of the issues that we had here is lack of awareness or lack of fully assessing the particular impacts on teachers that may be more susceptible to the virus because of a protected characteristic, whether that's previous health status or disability or another characteristic that makes them more susceptible to the virus itself. I am not aware of an example of good practice of states have dealt with school closures in many different ways. I'm not aware of a state that has done it in a way that avoids discriminatory impacts. And I feel the reason for that is lack of equality impact assessment. So consulting, I know I'm friends with many teachers around the world, actually, whose main concern has been that in making these decisions, the government hasn't actually consulted with them on what would be best and what would be feasible in terms of them delivering their curriculum, in terms of them being able to meet goals of exams and so on. So again, I would, I don't want to keep banging on about it, but again, I would say the best tool available to states is the collection of qualitative data by consultation with those that will be affected.
Thank you, Ariane, for that response. I'm afraid we are running out of time, as much as I think we would all like to continue these discussions, but we are running out of time, and in the interest of finishing on time, I'd like to just go back to each of the panelists to ask them in 30 seconds, if possible, if they have a really key takeaway, forward-looking recommendation for the audience, and perhaps we can start in the order in which people did their presentations. So we could start with Professor Payande.
Yes, thank you very much. I would just like to highlight very quickly a point made by pretty much all the presenters today about data collection, and just highlight what has been said, for example, also by Ariane Adams, that it needs to be about quantitative as well as qualitative data, and it needs to be about an inclusive consultation process. Just to very quickly address the point made by Sarkis Balkan about the danger of abuse of data. That is, of course, a legitimate fear. And that's why the committees usually highlight that the data collection, when it comes to criteria such as race, but it also applies to others, needs to be based on principles such as self-identification, anonymity, and needs to be voluntary. And also the data collection process as such must be inclusive. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Commissioner Sibagnoni, in 30 seconds, do you have a key takeaway recommendation?
Yes, my parting thought will be saying, I would like to emphasize what the South African state has done, the National Development Plan. And then the National Development Plan, when you look at it, it links to, or it talks to the sustainable development goals. And then there were some time frames that were set up to say by this year, the gap between the rich and the poor shall be minimized. Unfortunately, the advent of the pandemic has slowed down it. And then also to say South Africa is having a repeatable good constitution. We've got powers in terms of Section 184, subsection 3 of the Constitution, in terms of which the South African Human Rights Commission has powers, functions, or duties to call upon the organs of state to provide information insofar as the realization of the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. And lastly, I must say that we must also bear in mind Article 2, subsection 2 of the International Covenant of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Likewise, imposes a duty not to discriminate in the fulfillment of the socio-economic rights guaranteed in the covenant. I want to emphasize that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Ariane, we'll pass on to you for a very, very quick final recommendation.
Very quick, that for me, this crisis has shown a harsh and unforgiving light on the inequalities that exist in our world, and we must commit to emerge from it ready to forge a world in which we can all participate equally. And we cannot do this, in my view, without ensuring proper consultation and representation in decision making.
Thank you very much. Sarkis, your final word, please.
I just want to echo essentially what Ariana said. This pandemic is global, and I think our response to the challenges that have risen as a result of the pandemic have to be global in order to ensure that everything that we have worked on over the past several decades on sustainable development goals or on universality of human rights remains intact at the end of this pandemic, as opposed to every country retreating back to their own corners.
Thank you. And finally, do me so, please, your final takeaway point from this webinar.
Thank you. I think adopting feminist principles to strengthening universal health coverage. This requires linking human rights and SDGs, inclusive of anti-corruption work, COVID-19 bailout, and reducing inequalities. Thank
you very much. I think what we've heard today demonstrates quite clearly and quite powerfully that in human rights and the lessons that we have learned from the implementation and monitoring of human rights by all the different actors involved today, we already have many of the standards and tools and methodologies and know-how that we need to bring about sustainable recovery. It just requires that we must act and actively use these standards to address inequality in a more effective way, and that all the institutions represented here today have a role to play in this. If you're interested in reading any more about any of the issues that have been discussed today, I've just shared a document in the chat with some key resources from each of the organisations that's been represented. And this also includes a new publication by the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which outlines some of the key concepts and human rights standards that you've heard about today, but also from all the other organisations that have spoken. Thank you very much to all our panellists for your excellent presentations, and it's time to wrap up now. So thank you also to the audience for joining us, and we hope to be engaging with many of you again on these issues in the future. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you for inviting us. Goodbye.
Thank you.